If you are or would like to someday be a director, a cinematographer, or if you are into photography, then having a good and solid understanding of lenses, focal lengths, aperture, and how to pick the right lens for the right shot is very important. Even though I did cover a few similar things in the very first episode of Filmmaking for Noobs years ago, we're going to dive a bit more in depth into understanding of lenses, what all the numbers mean, and how to best choose a lens for each shot. Even if you're not a director or a DP, this episode will still contain a lot of useful information about lenses if you are into photography at all, or if you just simply want to know more about how lenses work. As a cinematographer or a director of photography, you should definitely have a really good understanding of lenses because you are the one who's in charge of the department, the camera department, who are the ones using lenses. As a director, you should also have a basic understanding of lenses as well as a good understanding of focal lengths and what they mean because you're the one as the director who gets to choose which lens to use and which shot you want. You can describe to the DP with a bit more accuracy or intelligence as far as what you're looking for when you say, oh, I think this would be great on a 12mm or on a 24mm, or yeah, we should go with 135mm for this shot. Then the DP knows exactly what you're looking for and what sort of tightness or wideness you want in your shot. Sometimes also the DP may run a lens by you and say, hey, are you okay with a 50mm for this shot? Having a good understanding of what that means allows you to say yes or no, rather than having no idea what the DP's talking about. We'll be looking at 3 different terms in this episode: focal length, aperture, and a little bit on depth of field, though we'll spend most of our time on the first 2. Every lens has a focal length. The focal length is the distance in millimeters from the optical center of the lens to the camera's sensor. The optical center of a lens is the point in the lens where all the light coming into the lens converges into a single point to form a sharp image. This is not necessarily the physical center of the lens, hence the phrase optical center. So imagine a long triangle being formed facing out of the lens and another from the same point facing toward the camera's sensor, where the light coming into the lens is brought to a point of focus before being flipped and spread out across the camera's sensor. But what's more important than the definition of focal length is actually understanding what the focal length number means and how it affects your lens and how you use your lens. So a lower number focal length is referred to as a shorter focal length or a shorter lens. Remember, the focal length is measuring distance, which means the lower the number, the shorter the length. The higher the number, the higher the length. So a higher number represents a longer focal length, or often referred to as a longer lens. A shorter focal length results in a wider angle of view, and a longer focal length results in a narrower angle of view. So the shorter the distance between the focal point and the sensor, the wider the angle is required to spread that light across the camera sensor. Which means on the other side of the lens, the side where light is entering the lens, the angle at which light is entering is also a much wider angle. This is compared to a longer lens where the longer focal length, or the longer the distance from the optical center or the focal point to the camera sensor, requires a much narrower angle in order for that light to cover the camera sensor. Which means on the other side, where light is coming in, it's coming in at a much more narrow angle as well. In simpler terms, what this means is that a shorter focal length equals a wider angle of view, which means you're seeing more of the environment, whereas a longer focal length equals a more narrow angle of view, which means you're seeing less of the environment. To give you an example, I set up my camera on a tripod in one place. I changed only the lens or the focal length and did not make any other setting adjustments to the camera, and also did not move the camera at all. Starting with a 15mm fisheye lens, the widest lens or the shortest lens that I own, we get the widest angle of view that my set of lenses can achieve. Then a 24mm lens, still wide but not quite as wide, 28mm, 35mm, 40mm, 50mm, 70mm, 100mm, 135mm, 200mm, and 300mm. So if you're trying to pick a lens and you're looking for a nice wide shot, you're probably looking for something in the 20 mil, 24, 28 mil range. Or if you're using a higher end cinema camera with higher end cinema lenses, the cinema world's a little bit different from like the photography lens world. So you might be looking at something like a 12 mil or 14 mil or an 18 mil lens. I should note that at the wider angles, it gets a little bit confusing because in some cases a 15 mil photographic lens is very fisheye, but in other cases a 12 mil lens on a cinema camera does not look fisheye. It looks pretty straight even though it's wider than a 15 mil. That just depends on how the lens is made, constructed, and how you're using it with the camera and the size of the sensor and a whole bunch of other variables. But that said, you're often going to find wider lenses that are still normal lenses, normal looking lenses for a higher end, at the higher end level and a higher end cinema camera. Whereas in the photography world, you are going to find some fisheye lenses in that range as well. So just be sure that you're picking out the right set of lenses and the right sensors and all that stuff I don't really want to get into right now. Yeah. But we will come back to the difference between cinema lenses and other non-cinema lenses or photography lenses in a few minutes. It's also worth noting that the camera sensor size does also have an effect on your field of view. Your lens has a specific focal length no matter what camera you use it on. The focal length never changes. It is specific to that lens itself, no matter what camera you use. At the same time, the angle of view is determined by your focal length, which means the angle of view never changes either. However, your field of view, which is a little bit different from angle of view, so the angle of view is actually your angle of view, the angle at which the light is coming into the lens, that never changes, but your field of view does change based on what camera and what camera's size and what sensor size your camera has, because the field of view is not changing the lens's focal length, it's not changing the lens's angle of view, but it's really just cropping off part of lens's angle of view, and you're only seeing a certain field of that overall image. Kind of confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. So the angle of view is referring to the angle at which light is entering the lens and then hitting a point before going back out of the lens on the other side to expose the sensor. Whereas the field of view is referring to the apparent angle of view that you're seeing based on the sensor's size. If your lens is designed to spread light out across the entire full frame size of a sensor, then if you have a smaller sensor, you're not going to be exposing the entire amount of light. There are different size sensors in the camera world. What is referred to as a full frame sensor means that it is basically the same size as a standard 35mm frame of film. So any sensor smaller than a full frame sensor or smaller than a 35mm frame of film is not full frame, or is often referred to as a crop frame. What this means is that it is cropping off part of the angle of view, part of the image, and giving you a much smaller apparent image. Depending on which size crop sensor you're using or how small it is compared to a full frame sensor, your crop sensor is going to have what's called a crop factor. The crop sensor is only capturing a portion of the image, therefore cropping the image. For example, an APS-C sensor is going to have a crop factor of 1.6 compared to a full frame sensor, and a micro four thirds sensor or MFT sensor is going to have a 2 times crop factor compared to a full frame sensor. Which means that a 24mm lens created for a full frame sensor, when used on APS-C sensor, is going to still be a 24mm focal length. However, you're cropping the image by 1.6 times, meaning that the apparent focal length, or what the camera sees, looks similar to or equivalent to roughly 38mm lens. Now the lens itself has not changed, the focal length is still the same, the angle of view is still the same, but you're simply cropping it by the size of your sensor and only seeing a portion of that, equivalent to what it would be like if you used a 38mm lens on a full frame camera. In the same regard, if you used a 24mm full frame lens on a micro four thirds sensor, it's going to have a 2 times crop factor, meaning that what you're getting on that micro four thirds sensor is going to look like a 48mm lens. It's still a 24mm lens with the same 24mm angle of view, but if you used a 48mm lens on a full frame camera, that's the same field of view you're going to see on that micro four thirds camera with a 24mm lens. Does that make sense? So 24 times 2 equals 48. 24 times 1.6 equals 38.4. However, do keep in mind that there are some lenses that are made for smaller sensors, and so those lenses will not actually work correctly on a full frame sensor because your sensor is going to be seeing off the lens's light that's coming in. However, in that case, if you're using a lens that's created for your smaller sensor, for APS-C sensor or for a micro four thirds sensor, then you don't have to worry about crop factors and multiplying and all that stuff, because a 16mm lens for an APS-C sensor is going to be a 16mm lens on that APS-C sensor, and it's going to look like you're using a 16mm lens on that sensor. Make sense? Now that you hopefully understand what focal length is, go back, watch this a few more times if that was confusing, because it's really confusing. Or kind of confusing. It's confusing to say, is what it is. Now that you understand what focal length is and what it means, it is worth noting that you will hear of two different types of lenses. Often people refer to them as either a zoom lens or a prime lens. A zoom lens just simply means that you're able to adjust the focal length, so it has a range of focal length. For example, this lens is a 70 to 300mm zoom lens, which means that I can adjust the focal length simply by turning the zoom ring without having to change the lens. However, a prime lens is a lens that has one fixed focal length. For example, this is a 15mm prime lens. That means that there is no zoom ring at all. I can't change the focal length of this lens. If I want a different focal length, I have to take the lens off and put a different lens on. If I want to be closer or farther from my subject, I have to physically move the camera closer or farther from the subject. Often if you hear someone refer to a lens as a 50mm or a 24mm, simply stating one focal length, they're probably referring to a prime lens. If you hear someone referring to a 70 to 300mm or a 24 to 70mm or a 16 to 35mm, mentioning two different focal lengths, they're probably referring to a zoom lens, even if they don't say the word prime or zoom. When choosing which lens to use for a shot, it is important to realize that the focal length is not just determining how wide or how narrow your field of view is, and it's not just determining how close to the subject or how far from the subject you have to be to get the right size shot and frame that you want, but you should understand that the focal length also determines how compressed or how stretched the image looks on camera. There are many situations, depending on the type of mood that you're trying to set or the type of emotion you want to convey or what type of genre or theme or whatever else is going on in the scene, you might want the same size shot, either a close-up or a medium shot or a wide shot, but you might want to make the background either look more stretched out or look more compressed. Maybe you want the actor to feel a bit more claustrophobic and you want the audience to feel that same emotion as well, or maybe you want to give off the impression that they're just in a really big open space. And so your focal length, which determines your field of view, is going to determine how big or how small the background and the room and everything else around the actor looks as well. To give you an example, here is a photo of myself on a 24mm lens. So now, changing the focal length and moving the camera either closer or farther away, my trusty friend that is helping me out with this video is going to do the best he can to maintain the same frame, to maintain the same size of me within the frame of the camera, but moving the camera farther and closer with different focal lengths to show you how much more compressed or stretched out the background and the entire image overall is. So moving the camera a bit closer, we put on a 15mm lens, and we're going to work our way longer from here. 24mm, 28mm, 35mm, 50mm, 70mm, 100mm, 135mm, 200mm, 300mm. You can see that even though we maintained the same size frame and I maintained the same size within the frame, the image itself and the background looked much more compressed as we got tighter, and it looked much more spread out, or made the room look bigger as we went wider. The second thing that we'll look at is aperture. The aperture is the size of the hole in your lens, which is letting light pass through the lens into the camera's sensor. This in turn determines how much light is coming into the camera. The more light that your lens lets in, the less light that you require on your set or on your subject in order to have a properly exposed image. The less light that you let into the camera, the more light you'll require on your subject or in the set in order to have a similar and properly exposed image. On cinema lenses, the aperture is measured by what's called a t-stop, whereas on all other types of lenses, the aperture is measured by what's called an f-stop. we will get into the difference of what that means. An f-stop is referring to the focal factor. The actual diameter of your lens's aperture, which is controlling how big or how small the aperture is and how much light is coming into the lens, is calculated by taking your focal length divided by your focal factor. So a 50mm lens with a focal factor of 2 means that the size of the aperture is 25mm in diameter, or 50 divided by 2. Whereas that same 50mm lens with an f-stop of 5 means that your focal factor is 5, 50 divided by 5 equals 10, which means that your diameter of your aperture is 2.5 times smaller at 10mm. That's why the larger the focal factor, the smaller the aperture and the less light coming in, whereas the smaller or lower the focal factor, the larger the aperture and the more light is coming in. As a quick demonstration, here's a photo of myself taken on a 24mm lens at f1.4. Without adjusting the lighting or any other settings on the camera, here's what happens as the focal factor, or the f-stop, increases, causing the aperture to become smaller because we're now dividing by a larger number. On cinema lenses, which are lenses that are usually much more expensive and much higher quality, designed specifically for cinema, not just for photography, your aperture is measured using t-stops instead of f-stops. The f-stop and t-stop measurement is a very similar concept and a very similar measurement. The difference is that the t-stop is much more accurate across the board of all cinema lenses. The f-stop, as we discussed, is a mathematical equation determining the size of the aperture based on the focal factor, and therefore determining the amount of light coming into the lens based solely upon the diameter of the aperture. So yes, it is true that decreasing the size of the aperture by a focal factor of 1 stop, for example from 2.8 to 4, it does mean that you're cutting the transmission of light in half, which is 1 stop less of light. However, from one lens to another lens, especially in the non-cinema lens world, f2.8 could be letting in a little bit less or a little bit more light than another lens at f2.8. The reason for this is because the f-stop is assuming the amount of light coming into the lens based solely upon the size of the diameter of the aperture. However, there are other factors within the lens, the construction of the lens, the amount of glass used, the different layers of glass used, the coatings applied to the glass, whatever else goes into the lens. There are other things inside that lens that could be reducing the transmission of light by up to 1/3 of a stop. Whereas in the cinema lens world, the t-stop, the t meaning tested, this is a tested value, not just a assumed mathematical theoretical value. T-stop is a tested value where they confirm that at t2.8, you're getting the same amount of light transmission as any other cinema lens at t2.8, regardless of what types of coatings are used or how the lens is constructed. So that means on one cinema lens with a t-stop of 2.8, your diameter of your aperture might actually be divided by a focal factor of 2.8, but on another cinema lens, the diameter of your aperture might be determined by a little bit larger or smaller focal factor, even though it's still t2.8. That's because the t value is telling you that you're getting exactly what you should expect from an f-stop of 2.8, regardless of which lens you're using. Hopefully that all makes sense. To keep things simple, we'll just keep referring to everything as f-stop, knowing that we can pretty much interchangeably use the numbers, even though the f-stop is a calculated theoretical value, whereas the t-stop is an exact tested value. The aperture is not only adjusting how much light comes into your lens, therefore determining how much light you require to properly expose a scene, but it also has a very big impact on your depth of field. Hence where we get to our third title, depth of field. When you bring a certain point of the environment to focus within a lens, the depth of field is how much extra space on either side of that plane of focus is also going to appear sharp or in focus before the focus drops off and becomes more and more out of focus. So a larger range of focus, which is referred to as a deeper depth of field, means that you have much more wiggle room as far as how far your subject can move forward or backward before they go out of focus. A shorter range of focus, or a shallower depth of field, means that a very smaller, more specific point is in focus where everything else is out of focus. So here's me at f11. It's really crappy looking because it's an ISO 6400, but you can see that the background and me are all pretty sharp and pretty well in focus. This is f8. The depth of field starts to get a bit more shallow, but everything is still pretty much in focus. f5.6. f4, you can definitely see how the depth of field is getting a bit more shallow. The background is becoming more and more out of focus. f2.8, the depth of field is becoming much more noticeably shallow. f2, and finally f1.4. You can see that it is a very shallow depth of field. As I move just a very small amount closer or farther from the camera, my face gets out of focus or back in focus. And you can see how blurry the background is behind me. This is referred to as a very shallow depth of field, compared to f8, where what you're seeing now is definitely not a shallow depth of field. Focal length does also play a part in depth of field as well, where a longer focal length will usually have a shallower depth of field at the same aperture as a shorter focal length. Whether you're choosing a lens to purchase, to rent, or just picking out which lens you want to use for each shot, hopefully all this information has really helped you to have a better understanding of what to look for in lenses or what to think about and consider as far as how to get the look and the shot that you want, or the look that you're going for. Whether it's a shallow depth of field or a deeper depth of field, or whether you're wanting a more compressed image or a more stretched out, bigger space looking image, or whatever it is that you're looking for, hopefully now you have a better understanding of how focal lengths and apertures play into all of those things and determine how your shot's going to look. Generally speaking, something like a 12mm, 14mm, 18mm, 20 or 24 or 28mm is going to be a really nice lens to use for a wide shot. A 35mm, 50mm, or 85mm would be a really great option to use for either a typical close-up or a medium shot, whatever traditional coverage you would likely be getting of your actors. Or if you wanted something that looked a bit more distant or a bit more compressed, or even just a much shallower depth of field, then something like a 100mm, a 135, or even a 200mm would be a great option on a close-up, especially a tighter close-up. Which means if you're wanting a nice wide shot, don't ask your DP to throw on the 85. If you're wanting a tight close-up, don't ask the DP to throw on a 12mm, unless you're going for some really artsy, specific thing with a camera really close to the actor. It's also important to note that lenses do have what's called a minimum focus distance. You'll often hear camera operators or camera assistants refer to this as mins. So if you hear them say, "we are inside the mins," that means we are closer than the minimum focusing distance. The minimum focusing distance is the minimum distance that an object or subject has to be from the lens in order to actually get a sharp image. If your object or subject is too close to the lens or closer than the minimum focusing distance, you will not be able to get a sharp image using that lens. Generally, the minimum focusing distance will normally increase as the focal length increases. This may differ from lens to lens, but for a general rule of thumb is you can usually expect a wider lens to have a shorter minimum distance, whereas a longer lens is going to have a farther or longer minimum distance. There are, however, two pretty common ways to get around this obstacle if for some reason you need to focus on a subject that is closer than your minimum focusing distance. First, there are some lenses that are called macro lenses. What this means is that the minimum focusing distance on that lens is actually much shorter or closer than you would typically expect for that focal length of lens. A macro lens is designed to allow you to get really close-up shots of your subject. The second way to get around this obstacle is by using what's called a diopter. A diopter is a special piece of glass that goes in front of the lens, and it helps the lens to focus on subjects or objects that are closer than its minimum focusing distance. Diopters do come in various strengths, which you would choose based on how low of a distance you're trying to get or what lens you're using. Hopefully this episode has given you a very good understanding of lenses, apertures, focal lengths, all that good stuff, how they work, and how to make the most of that information when deciding what lens to purchase or rent or use for a shot. As always, please share any questions or thoughts in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe if you found this helpful. Come back next Friday for more. Thanks for watching.